I'm not even going to say that because that's a completely separate case. But
yeah.
But like South Africa and Australia, for example, have clearly always had their own like super vibrant scenes because they've got the conditions as well, you know. But I think East Coast states like Europe, it's been a bit slower, and I think I think these days they're catching up, aren't they? And definitely have like their own vibrant, unique takes on it, really. Which like you say, it's got to be a good thing.
Yeah, well, I like it. I personally like it because I think it adds more color and flavor to these sports. You know, there's only so much, you know, that one area can produce, right? Like, you know, California, you know, it's. I feel like there's only so much it can keep pumping out, and you need some freshness to come into it, basically. Now, with this book, like making this book, it must have satisfied like that urge for you, though, to kind of do this pilgrimage as it's been described. How did you and Owen come up with this concept? What was the plan? Was this all like, did you plan it all out, or was it more organic as you went along and made this?
It was definitely organic. I mean, the way that it came about was, so we did the trip to record a load of episodes. You know, me and Owen are old friends, and I started the podcast about 4.5 years ago, and he's like a really close mate of mine. We really, you know, he's someone I've known for a long time, creatively really get on with. So we're always like looking for reasons to work together. And my background, like I'm a journalist, and one of the things I learned quite early on was how to blag free trips. By, you know, like essential skill of anyone in these games if you try to sort of make a living out of it. So obviously I had the magazine back in the day as an outlet, and we used to use that as an excuse to travel, basically. And you know, I kind of realized how that game worked like quite early on. So when the podcast started taking off, I was like, okay, cool, well, I can just sort of do the same thing, really. So we went to Ireland a few years ago, went to like Lahinch and went and sort of interviewed like Fergal Smith and Easky Britton and a load of the guys over there. And that was the first time me and Owen like kind of collaborated. Like I just said to him, do you want to come? Like I can sort it, you know, I'll sort it out. You come and take pictures, I'll do the interview. So we did that. That worked really well. And then a year later, we went back to Ireland to a town called Strand Hill.
Yep.
Where I interviewed a guy called Noah Lane. I interviewed a bodyboarder called Shambles, who's really well known in Ireland. Anyway, so we did those, and then I was like, well, you know, we could probably do something more ambitious. So I approached the Californian Tourist Board in the UK and just said, look, you know, I want to do this trip. I'm going to go and do like as many podcasts as possible in like 3 weeks. And, you know, at the time that was like when it was all like, oh yeah, podcasts. Yeah, we should do loads of podcasts like in the marketing world. So they were like, cool. Well, you know, so basically they paid for it. And in return,
sick.
I set up, I think 15 episodes, and then like some stories as well. So I was going to do a story for Vice about the Wolsey fire in Malibu, because it was a few weeks after that. And then I was doing a piece for a UK action sports website about the trip. So that was the original plan. And the way that we did it was I flew to San Francisco and I went up to Tahoe and did a load of stuff up there.
Load of stuff, meaning snowboarding, right?
Yeah. A lot of that.
Load of stuff, and then, like snowboarding and, you know, just getting some deep powder. Yeah, I was really busy, you know.
Yeah, it was good. It was good actually. Yeah. No, and then interviewed, I think I did about 4 interviews up there. And then Owen flew out to LA and I met him in Ventura. And then we had 10 days to get down to San Diego. And that's when we did all the ones that are in the book. So that's when we did Herbie, Jamie Thomas, Cara Beth, and also just caught up with loads of old guests as well.
Yeah.
So, because obviously a lot of the people I'd interviewed, I'd met previously, and I was very much like, we're going to be in California. Do you fancy meeting up? So we did that, which was an absolute mission. Some days we were doing like 2 episodes a day, and doing a lot of driving up and down the coast. But it was really fun. And the way that it kind of ended up panning out was Owen would drive to the interviews while I sort of basically crammed on my phone to prepare for him. And then I would drive back from the interviews and he'd shoot. And then in the night when I was prepping sorting everything out, like making sure all my files were sorted, doing all the admin that comes with the podcast, he'd go and shoot for an hour or so.
Nice.
So all that work that's in the book, he did in like an hour a day for like 10 days. Yeah, which is, when you see the book, I mean, that is actually quite mind blowing, isn't it?
It's stunning.
So
it's amazing. There's a lot of beautiful, iconic imagery, almost like really representative of the area for sure. Or the
exactly.
It's definitely an idealized vision of California for sure. I would say. Yeah,
and he just really did that because that's what he does.
Yeah.
So I can't really praise him or say how much I respect what he does as a creative. Like he is properly the real deal. And I'm really lucky that he kind of does this thing with me as a bit of a fuck about, really. Anyway, so we got back. I put the episodes out, and then he went through all his shots. And at that point, this is a couple of years ago, we were like, we could definitely do a book. There's enough. Yeah. There's enough here. So but we didn't have a plan at all, and it evolved. It went through a lot of different iterations, let's put it that way. At one point we were going to crowdfund it.
Yeah.
At one point, California were going to pay for it, and then COVID sort of paid to that. And then a year ago, basically a friend of mine, I actually talked about it on the podcast because I spoke about it a lot.
Yeah.
Because I always do like a bit at the end of the episodes where I sort of just talk shit, really, which
you have your little
again
outro.
has quite
your little outro. It's nice.
Yeah, exactly. And people really seem to quite like that. Anyway, a friend of mine was listening to it and he said, "Oh, well, he works for this. He was at the time working for this social network, and he was like, well, I can probably give you some money to be honest, to do it. Like, how much you need?" And so I was like, well, we kind of need like this much money. So he said, all right, well, I reckon we can get that. So when that happened, and I was very much like, look, I'm not putting loads of logos on it. I'm not making it a thing. Like, if you want to do it, like, we want full creative control, all that stuff, which he amazingly went for. So at that point, we then started working out what it was actually going to be about. And that's when the theme that you've identified started to become apparent, because originally I just really wanted to use it as a forum for his pictures.
Yeah.
And then we had the idea to actually get all the people that we'd interviewed to contribute, or to get people that I'd previously interviewed to contribute. So, like that's how we got Chaz involved, and like Rob Machado, because they've been on the podcast. So I basically got hold of them and said, look, we're doing a book. Do you want to contribute? And they all said yes, which was great. They all were like, yeah, it sounds cool. Let's do it. And then from that point, I almost started to work out what it was about, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
So it was quite an unusual. I've been lucky enough to have a few books published over the years, and normally you do it the other way. You
map it out.
The book is about this, and then we're going to do it that way. What was interesting about doing it this way was, firstly, we were very lucky because we had the luxury of someone else paying for it, so we had time and the ability to self-publish. Because I'd also been chatting to a publisher a bit about doing a book, but they had really specific ideas which I didn't really agree with, so I just said no in the end. And doing it this way was a real privilege because we could just take our time to do it. And then as it went on, I was like, actually, this is about our perception and relationship with California action sports culture. Just a final thing to say about that. What's quite interesting is I think even now that we've finished it, we actually spoke about this the other day. I think we both think it's quite naive. I think, you used the word idealized, and I think I think when we looked at, we've had a few months now, it's finished, the scars have healed, from actually doing the work.
Yeah.
So can kind of look at it a bit more objectively. And I think what we think is that it is a bit naive, really. It is a bit like, here's a version of the story that's actually quite. So what we're going to do, and this is one of the most interesting things about the whole project, is we're going to go back and we're going to do another one actually next year.
Really?
Perhaps unsurprisingly, the Californian tourist board are quite pleased with
well, they got a lot of bang for buck on that, actually. They got a book out of it and a series of podcasts, like great social media posts. I mean, it's good value.
Yeah, so I was like, can we go back? When I sent them the book, and they were like, yeah. So I think we're going to go, well, I think what we're thinking now is actually we're going to do a few of them, and we're going to go back to California, and we're going to tell we're going to find another version of the story that isn't this, that's a more modern version of the story, which perhaps a slightly less comfortable version of the story, because that's kind of what my podcast is about. Like, my podcast isn't really about the whitewashed classic, sort of take on it. So I think the book has, as a personal story of that relationship, as we described earlier, is completely legitimate because that is how I see it and that is how it's been for me. But as an actual reflection of it, I do feel it's a bit of a whitewash in like perhaps both senses of the word, really. And I kind of feel now, like, I'm really into creative things where you kind of don't really understand what they're about until you finish them, which I think is quite a frequent theme of creativity. So for me, I've been a bit like, yeah, I only get it now that it's done, and now the thing to do is to use the format that we've kind of unwittingly created to tell different stories of the different versions of this story. So I'd really like to go to Hawaii and do one. Because obviously that is inflammatory, and there's an interesting episode of a podcast that my friends Lauren and Dave do, the Water People podcast.
Yep.
You know that?
Yes, very much so.
I mean that, and so they just did an episode with Isaiah, like a Hawaiian surfer, and it's really tactfully dealt with, but there's a lot of quite pointed conversation about the fact that the Californian story of action sports very evidently doesn't actually tell anything like the story, because that part of the history has been kind of brushed under the carpet and not dealt with properly. If you look at the classic sort of like history of surfing narratives, they tend to tell the same stories. They tend to start in the same place.
Yeah. It's California's surf story, basically, a lot of it. It's whitewashed in many regards.
And that's kind of what I'm getting at. I think that's what we've unwittingly contributed to. And I do think it's a total standalone piece of work. I'm not trying, if anyone's listening, I'm not saying don't be interested in it or look at it or whatever, because I don't buy this thing. It's a piece of shit. But I just think you got to be like, I've got to be aware of that. And I've got to, now that I've kind of, looked at it, I think it's a totally legitimate interpretation of it. And I'm actually really surprised that no one else has called us out on it. The only person that actually has is Lauren Hill from the Water People podcast, who contributed to the book and did a post on social very generously to promote it. And
I was going to call you out on it and everything. Gosh, you beat me to it.
Yeah. And she's very, 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 in a very tactful way, because she's great, has kind of made that point. And I was like, yeah, no, that is a completely fair point. Like, I'll totally take